Do you need this, Mrs. Kemp?
Hello everybody, this is Mad Matt. Why is my mouth not moving? Because this effect takes too damn long in post. You're watching Movie Mattness. It's almost Halloween, and everyone on the internet is discussing their favorite horror films. The big question is subjective. What is the scariest film ever made? I'm not going to go there. Instead, I'm going to forego any conversation about my favorite horror films, most of which are foreign, and instead look into a few horror films that I find interesting. Now, interesting is such a, well, it's an interesting word. Often with cinema, we use it as a backhanded compliment, a way of describing a film that sucks but that we cannot entirely dismiss. I'll be upfront with you, most of the following movies suck. What they all have in common is that they represent, for me anyway, a magical time in the mid-1980s when these very titles frequented mom-and-pop video stores. They may not all be masterpieces, but they are definitely interesting. First on the block is Amityville 2: The Possession. In 1977, the horror novel The Amityville Horror by Jay Anson became a bestseller due to its claim that it was based on a true story. The book was adapted to a film in 1979 starring Margot Kidder and James Brolin, which inspired Amityville 2, an awful prequel 3 years later. In Amityville 2, a family moves into the iconic haunted house only to have their goofy son, fittingly named Sonny, become possessed by a demon. Sonny proceeds to kill the entire family, but not before having sex with his sister. Now, why do I find this film interesting? Because in 1982, I saw it at a midnight show, and about the time the ubiquitous exorcism rolled around, when Sonny started writhing on the floor, a drunk in the back row shouted, "I am the demon of breakdance." Some moments stay burned in your memory forever. Next on the list is the slightly better An American Werewolf in London, about a student backpacking across England who is bitten by a werewolf and becomes a werewolf himself. Unlike the other films on this list, An American Werewolf in London is a solid horror flick. There are some moments of real tension, especially when the werewolf pursues a victim through a London tube station, and the lovely Jenny Agutter of Walkabout and Logan's Run fame does a pretty steamy nude scene. But perhaps the most interesting thing about American Werewolf in London is that it stars this guy. I'm a pepper, he's a pepper, she's a pepper. If you drink Dr. Pepper, you're a pepper too. From a great horror film to one that makes you feel dirty, next on our list is the icky psychological drama The Baby. Here is the story of a demented mother who has kept her adult son in a state of emotional infancy since birth, in essence making him a man-sized baby. The film is rounded out by two twisted sisters, one who has sex with baby on a regular basis, and another who likes to torture him with a cattle prod. Even though everyone gets what's coming to her in the end, it's hard to watch this film without feeling like you need a shower afterwards. What makes it even more interesting is that it's directed by Ted Post, who put out this film the same year he directed Clint Eastwood in Magnum Force. Talk about 100% weird. Next up to bat is the 1981 low-rent slasher flick The Burning, a movie that owes more than a little to Friday the 13th. Once again, we have horny teenagers partying in cabins in the woods, only to be picked off one by the horribly burned former caretaker who wields a mean set of head shears. What makes this movie interesting is that one of the kids is the guy who played Mark Ratner in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and another is Jason Alexander, aka George Costanza, when he still had hair. I watched this film in my local theater, believe it or not, and after discovering a weird prop in the storeroom of our local college's theater department, I was inspired to pay homage to The Burning in this scene from my early adventures in Super 8 filmmaking.
Tough luck, Ernie. The first pack of cigarettes is on you.
A horror movie list would not be complete without something by Stephen King. I happen to love King as a writer, but I hate about 80% of the films inspired by his work. So for my money, here's one of the worst, Children of the Corn. What an awful film. Peter Horton, future hunk of 30-something, and Linda Hamilton, so sexy here before she copped that militant psycho chic of the Terminator movies, are a cute couple who stumble upon a deserted town run by a bunch of creepy cultist children led by the demonic Isaac. Why is this film interesting to me? When I saw it in the theater in 1984, I made the mistake of drinking large quantities of alcohol, which made me susceptible to the suggestion of one of my dorm mates who called it the most terrifying film he had ever seen. As such, I was on edge for the entire 92-minute running time, and that night I had nightmares about being back in middle school and this creepy bastard giving me a swirly. Which is kind of funny since even Stephen King says this is the dumbest movie ever made. Next on the list is The Omen III, The Final Conflict. If you followed the Omen series, you know it's about a creepy little boy named Damien Thorne who, as it turns out, is the Antichrist. By the time we get to Omen 3, Damien has grown up to look like the Australian actor Sam Neill, and since the second coming of Christ is nigh, he pulls a King Herod and instructs his followers to kill all babies born on a certain night under a unique alignment of stars. His followers obey, of course, which really takes this movie to sickening heights. There's even a creepy image of a burned baby in a crib, which I promise you was not the inspiration for my indie film Baby's Breath. In the end, Jesus himself comes and puts Damien in his place. And how many horror movies end with the Son of God in their final frame? All in all, this movie doesn't know where to go, which is what makes it perhaps the most interesting film on the list. Finally, we end our list with a low-rent horror film that purports to be inspired by the master himself, H.P. Lovecraft. Of course, we're talking about the 1988 bust, The Unnameable. You've seen this film before. A group of goofy college kids go investigate a haunted house late at night. The two prettiest of the bunch go off to have sex, and in the throes of passion, the girl sees something awful, in this case, a papier-mâché severed head. Later, it turns out, an ancient evil lives in the cellar or some such nonsense, and it looks a little something like this. What is interesting about this monster is that it's played by a dancer named Katrine Alexander in her only film credit, and it's a bit disjointing to see such a horrifying face on such a beautiful body. But what the hell, it's 80s horror. Sometimes you have to let art just sort of flow over you. And that wraps up our list of interesting Halloween horror films. Again, I'm not saying these are great, and I can really only recommend An American Werewolf in London. But if you want a taste of the kind of garbage I watched in college, this might be right up your alley. If you find none of these interesting, you might want to curl up with a good book this Halloween. May I suggest mine?
All right, we've seen what you can do with a boy. How are you when they come a little bigger?